Hey, welcome back. In the last video, we created our capsule component and we set it to be the root. In this video, we need to add some more components. Specifically, we need some meshes for the base and the turret part of our tank. And we also need a projectile spawn point, as we've discussed in previous lectures. So let's hop into VS Code. Now here in basepawn.h, we have our capsule component. We can add our other components in this private section just below it. So for our meshes, we want to use uStaticMesh component. And of course, these will be pointers, as this isn't a base type. And the first mesh I'm going to call base mesh. And just like capsule comp, base mesh will get its own uProperty macro. Now notice uStaticMesh component is not giving me an error for not forward declaring it. That's because uStaticMesh component is included by default in all actors. And of course, pawns are actors. So it has uStaticMesh component. Now, if you're wondering how to know which types are included by default and which are not, you can always try to compile and see if you get an error. We know what the error looks like when you fail to include a header that you need. Another approach would be to always forward declare and always include. Header files for Unreal Engine types have include guards that prevent them from being included multiple times in a single file. In fact, the very header we're in has one of these. It's called Pragma Once. So anyway, we have our base mesh, and we'd like another static mesh component. So this will be a uStaticMesh component pointer, and this will be for the turret. So I'm going to call this turret mesh. And just like base mesh, it will also get a uProperty macro. So now that we have our base mesh and turret mesh pointers, it's time to actually construct these. So let's head over to basepawn.cpp and do that in the constructor here. So first we're going to say base mesh, and we'll assign this the value returned by createDefaultSubObject. Now before I fill it in, why don't you go ahead and type in the correct type here. That's right, it's uStaticMesh component. Now for the name, we're going to use the text macro, and we can call this base mesh. Now it's important that we attach base mesh to something. Since we'd like the mesh to follow the capsule component around as we're moving the pawn, we're going to attach it to the root. So base mesh has a function called setupAttachment. And setupAttachment takes a scene component to attach to. We're going to attach base mesh to capsule comp. We could easily have passed root component in here. Now we're going to create the turret mesh in the same way. So turret mesh equals createDefaultSubObject, and this will also be a uStaticMesh component. And for the name for this one, we'll call this turret mesh. Now we mentioned previously that we'd like the turret mesh to be attached to base mesh. So we can say turret mesh setupAttachment, and the component we'll attach it to will be base mesh. So we'll pass base mesh in as the argument. So where does setupAttachment come from? If we right-click and go to definition, we'll see that it's a function here in scene component. So all scene components have this function. So we'll close out of scene component. Now you're probably noticing the IntelliSense errors saying pointer to incomplete class type. This is actually another false error, and that extension we downloaded doesn't actually fix this. But this compiles just fine, so we don't need to worry about it. Now if it's bothering you, you could just add the include components / static mesh component.h, and that'll get rid of those red squigglies. And as I mentioned, these have include guards, so they won't be included twice. So that's up to you. I'll go ahead and leave the include here just so we don't get those squigglies. So now that we have our base mesh and our turret mesh, the only thing left is our projectile spawn point. So this will be your challenge. Create a pointer called projectile spawn point. Choose the correct type that's appropriate for a projectile spawn point and give it a name using the text macro in createDefaultSubObject. Attach the projectile spawn point to the turret mesh. And a question I want you to think about is, do we need to include its header file? Pause the video and create this component now. All right, so let's add this next component. Now, the projectile spawn point will be a uScene component, and we'll call this projectile spawn point. Now we'll add a uProperty macro. That's okay if you didn't do this. If you didn't, just go ahead and add the uProperty macro now. Now let's go to basepawn.cpp and construct this component. So we're going to say projectile spawn point and create default subobject, and this will be a uScene component. Now you probably gave this an awesome name. I'm just going to call it spawn point. And we need to set up the attachment for this. So we're going to say projectile spawn point, set up attachment, and we'll attach this to turret mesh. And there we go. So we can compile this, make sure everything compiles successfully, and we have a successful compile. So everything's looking great. So in this video, we created static mesh components, and we saw that we didn't need to include the headers for those. They were already included by default. We also created a scene component called projectile spawn point, and our code compiled just fine without including the header for that as well. We'll be creating a blueprint based on our BasePawn C++ class very soon. I'll see you in the next video.